On a crisp autumn morning in the bustling streets of Metro City, Officer James Mitchell adjusted his badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car. The early sunlight caught the polished surface, but the shine couldn't mask the darkness that lurked beneath. After 15 years on the force, Mitchell had mastered the art of appearing to be the model police officer while running one of the most sophisticated car theft schemes in the department's history. His fellow officers called him Eagle Eye for his uncanny ability to spot violations that nobody else could see. What they didn't know was that those eagle eyes were really scanning for specific targets, high-end cars driven by people he thought wouldn't fight back. Mitchell had a system, perfectly crafted over years of practice. He knew exactly which streets to patrol, which times yielded the best opportunities, and most importantly, which drivers to target. That morning started like any other. Mitchell sat in his usual spot, hidden just around the corner from Oak Lane, one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. This was his favorite hunting ground, where luxury cars were as common as coffee shops. He'd park there, pretending to monitor speed violations while actually studying the patterns of residents who drove the most expensive vehicles. His radio crackled with routine calls, but Mitchell stayed put. Experience had taught him that patience was key. He sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and checked his watch. It was almost time. The morning rush would begin soon, when successful professionals would head to their offices downtown. What made Mitchell particularly dangerous wasn't just his badge, it was his understanding of human nature. He knew how to appear professional and courteous while slowly tightening his grip. His voice would remain calm and official, making his victims doubt their own instincts even as he violated their rights. He had perfected the art of making his actions seem routine, legitimate, and unquestionable. Over the years, complaints had piled up against him, but they always seemed to vanish into thin air. Mitchell had friends in high places, or more accurately, he had dirt on people in high places. A network of corrupt officials and crooked tow truck operators helped him keep his scheme running smoothly. Each person got their cut, and everyone stayed quiet. The truth was, Mitchell wasn't just corrupt. He was smart about his corruption. He kept detailed mental notes about which officers were on duty during his special traffic stops, which security cameras might be watching, and which routes would keep his activities hidden from honest cops. He had even memorized the blind spots in the department's GPS tracking system. That morning, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the unusually clear sky, or perhaps it was the extra shot of espresso in his coffee, but Mitchell felt especially alert. His instincts, honed by years of predatory observation, told him today would bring something interesting. He just didn't realize that this feeling of anticipation was actually the first whisper of warning, a warning that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. As the morning traffic began to pick up, Mitchell noticed his hands were unusually steady on the steering wheel. Usually there was a slight tremor of excitement when he was about to begin his hunt. Today, that steady calm felt like a sign. He was ready for what would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his career, though he didn't know it yet. What Officer Mitchell couldn't have known, as he sat there in his patrol car playing Predator, was that fate had finally decided to turn the tables. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and justice was wearing a very different face than he'd expected. But for now, he just watched and waited, like a spider in its web, completely unaware that his next target would turn out to be his last. Dr. Maya Thompson's life was the kind of success story that inspired others. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she had worked her way through medical school with determination and countless sleepless nights. Now, at 38, she was one of the city's most respected neurosurgeons. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour emergency surgery that saved a young father's life. Walking through the hospital's parking garage at 3 a.m., her footsteps echoed against the concrete walls. The silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class waited for her like a faithful friend. This car wasn't just transportation. It was a promise she'd made to herself back in medical school. One day, she had whispered while riding the bus to her night shift job, I'll drive something that shows the world dreams come true. The leather seats still had that new car smell, mixed with the subtle scent of her favorite lavender air freshener. As she settled in, she let out a deep breath, finally allowing the tension from the surgery to release. Her patient would live, would see his children grow up. Moments like these made every sacrifice worth it. The city streets were quiet at this hour. Street lights cast long shadows as she drove, her mind already planning tomorrow's rounds. She had 3 scheduled surgeries and a board meeting to prepare for. The clock on her dashboard showed 3:27 a.m. when she first noticed the police cruiser in her rearview mirror. She wasn't speeding. Her card system would have alerted her. The taillights were working perfectly. She'd just had them checked during last week's maintenance. Yet there was Officer Mitchell, blue lights flashing, signaling her to pull over. A familiar weight settled in her stomach, one she thought she'd left behind with her old Honda Civic days. As she pulled to the curb, Dr. Thompson did what had become second nature to many professional women in her position. She turned on her interior lights, placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, and reached slowly to turn on her phone's recording app. The dash cam she'd installed last month was already silently doing its job, uploading every second to secure cloud storage. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach. His walk was confident, almost swaggering. The beam of his flashlight swept across her license plate, then through her windows. Dr. Thompson kept her face neutral, though she noticed how his eyes lingered on her designer watch, the luxury car's interior, her hospital ID badge still clipped to her coat. "License and registration," he demanded, not bothering with the usual "good evening." His tone carried an edge of disbelief, as if her very presence in this car was suspicious. As she reached for her glove compartment, moving deliberately slow, she caught a glimpse of his nameplate. Officer J. Mitchell. While she handed over her documents, her mind was already several steps ahead. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay calm and think strategically. She noticed how Officer Mitchell's body camera light wasn't on, how his questions seemed designed to provoke rather than investigate. What happened next would have broken many people. The accusations of drug trafficking, the demand to search her car, the call for a K-9 unit. It was a carefully choreographed dance of intimidation. But Dr. Thompson had spent too many years in operating rooms, making split-second decisions with lives on the line, to be easily rattled. As she stood on the sidewalk watching Officer Mitchell discover supposed evidence, she remembered something her grandmother used to say. Sometimes the best revenge is letting someone think they've won, right up until they realize they've lost everything. Little did Officer Mitchell know, but his perfect record was about to meet its match in someone who had spent her entire life overcoming obstacles far greater than one corrupt cop. The night air grew colder as Officer Mitchell conducted his investigation. Every move he made was calculated, a performance he perfected over countless similar stops. He circled Dr. Thompson's Mercedes like a shark, his flashlight beam dancing across the pristine paint job. The look in his eyes wasn't just greed. It was a deep-seated belief that someone like her couldn't possibly own a car like this legitimately. "Step away from the vehicle," he commanded, his voice carrying that false note of authority that had intimidated so many before. "We've received reports of drug trafficking in vehicles matching this description." It was a lie, of course, but one he'd used successfully many times. What made this lie particularly insulting was how he glanced at her hospital scrubs, as if they were some kind of costume. Dr. Thompson stood quietly, her phone still recording in her coat pocket. She watched as Mitchell called in a tow truck, not from the department's usual service, but from Big Al's Towing, a company she'd later learn was central to his scheme. The tow truck arrived suspiciously quickly, as if it had been waiting nearby all along. "We'll need to impound your vehicle for further investigation," Mitchell announced, not even trying to hide his smirk. "You can pick it up once we complete our search, if everything checks out." The last part was delivered with a tone that suggested things would definitely not check out. As the tow truck driver hooked up her Mercedes, Dr. Thompson noticed something interesting. The driver didn't fill out the usual impound paperwork. Instead, he exchanged a knowing look with Mitchell, their silent communication speaking volumes about their partnership in crime. Most people would have panicked at this point, but Dr. Thompson had spent years in emergency rooms where keeping cool under pressure meant the difference between life and death. She pulled out her phone, deliberately visible, and called for a rideshare service. Mitchell's eyebrows raised slightly. He'd expected begging, maybe tears, not this calm acceptance. What Mitchell didn't know was that Dr. Thompson was already putting pieces together in her mind. The missing paperwork, the suspicious towing company, his conveniently disabled body camera, her own dashcam footage safely uploaded to the cloud. She'd spent enough time in hospital administration to know how to document everything, how to build a case that would stand up to scrutiny. As she waited for her ride, she noticed Mitchell growing increasingly uneasy with her calmness. He was used to victims who fought back or broke down, not someone who stood there studying him like a particularly interesting medical case. His hand kept touching his collar, a nervous tick that betrayed his growing discomfort. Her ride arrived, a modest sit-in that seemed to disappoint Mitchell. Perhaps he'd hoped she'd call someone in another luxury car he could target. As she opened the car door, she turned to face him one last time. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the same steady tone she used to deliver difficult news to patients' families. "I hope you're as thorough with your paperwork as you are with your traffic stops." The comment hit its mark. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mitchell's face. In all his years of running this scheme, no one had ever mentioned paperwork with quite that tone, like someone who knew exactly what should be filed, and when, and where. As her ride pulled away, Dr. Thompson was already composing emails in her head. One to her friend on the hospital board who played golf with the police commissioner, another to her college roommate who now worked as an investigative journalist, and a third to her cousin, a civil rights attorney who'd been looking for a case exactly like this. Mitchell stood watching the taillights disappear into the night, still feeling smugly victorious. He had no idea that this routine traffic stop had just become the beginning of his downfall. In his arrogance, he'd finally picked the wrong target, someone with not just the resources to fight back, but the wisdom to do it right. Inside her home office, Dr. Thompson sat at her desk, still wearing her surgical scrubs from hours ago. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, but she hadn't slept a wink. Instead, she'd spent the last few hours making calls and gathering information. Her training as a surgeon had taught her that preparation was everything. She pulled up the dashcam footage on her laptop, watching the entire incident again. The crystal-clear video showed every moment, from Mitchell's initial approach to the suspicious arrival of the tow truck. But what really caught her attention was something she hadn't noticed during the stop. Mitchell's casual wave to another police car that passed by, suggesting this wasn't just one corrupt officer, but possibly part of a larger operation. Her phone buzzed with a message from her friend on the hospital board. "Just got off the phone with Lisa, the police commissioner's wife. She's furious. Apparently, you're not the first doctor this has happened to." Meeting set for 9 a.m., Dr. Thompson allowed herself a small smile. The pieces were falling into place faster than she'd expected. Opening her browser, she began searching through local news archives. Pattern recognition was a skill she'd honed over years of diagnosing complex neurological cases, and something about Mitchell's behavior felt too practiced, too routine. Sure enough, buried in local news websites and community forums, she found dozens of similar stories. Luxury cars impounded, mysterious fees demanded, vehicles returning with missing parts, all following traffic stops in the same area. Her cousin, the civil rights attorney, had sent over some interesting documents. Previous complaints against Mitchell had been filed but mysteriously disappeared from official records. The towing company, Big Al's, had connections to several other impound cases, all involving high-end vehicles. The pattern was becoming clearer with each piece of information. A knock at her door interrupted her research. It was her neighbor. a retired FBI agent who'd always been friendly during their morning jogs. She'd called him earlier, and his face lit up when he saw the evidence she'd gathered. "This is bigger than Mitchell," he said, settling into a chair. "I've seen cases like this before. The towing company is usually the key. They're the ones who move the parts across state lines." Together, they spread out documents across her dining room table. The retired agent showed her how to connect the dots, linking Mitchell's shift patterns with reported car thefts, matching towing company records with complaints of missing vehicles. It was like solving a complex medical puzzle, but instead of symptoms, they were tracking criminal behavior. While they worked, her phone kept buzzing with messages. Other victims had started reaching out through mutual contacts. A lawyer whose BMW disappeared after a traffic stop. A business owner whose Audi came back with all its high-end electronics stripped. Each story added another layer to their growing case. The most surprising call came from a young officer in Mitchell's own precinct. Speaking in hushed tones, he shared how Mitchell's scheme was an open secret among certain officers. Some stayed quiet out of fear, others because they were getting a cut of the profits. The young officer had kept detailed notes, waiting for someone with enough influence to finally take action. Dr. Thompson looked at her watch. It was almost time for the meeting with the police commissioner's wife. Her dining room had transformed into something between a war room and an investigation headquarters. Papers covered every surface. Her laptop showed multiple browser tabs of research, and her phone kept lighting up with new messages from people eager to help. She gathered the most compelling evidence into a folder: the dashcam footage, the pattern of complaints, the towing company records. Years of presenting complex medical cases to hospital boards had taught her how to make complicated information clear and convincing. As she prepared to leave, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked tired but determined, still in her scrubs from yesterday's surgery. Mitchell had no idea that while he was probably sleeping soundly, thinking he'd pulled off another perfect scam, an entire network of professionals was mobilizing against him. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't a dramatic confrontation. It's the quiet gathering of evidence by people who know exactly how to use it. The police commissioner's office was impressive, with its wood-paneled walls and view of the city skyline. But Dr. Thompson wasn't intimidated. She presented in much more demanding situations. She sat at the large conference table, surrounded by people who could make real change happen. The commissioner, his wife, 2 internal affairs officers, and her civil rights attorney cousin. "This stops today," the commissioner said, his face grim as he watched the dashcam footage. His wife, who sat on the hospital board with Dr. Thompson, kept shaking her head in disbelief. The video was damning enough, but it was the pattern Dr. Thompson revealed that really caught everyone's attention. "We've identified 37 similar cases in the past year alone," Dr. Thompson explained, spreading out her carefully organized evidence. "Each one involves Officer Mitchell, Big Al's towing, and a luxury vehicle. The cars either disappear completely or return, with expensive parts missing." She spoke with the same precise clarity she used when explaining complex medical procedures. The internal affairs officers exchanged worried looks. One of them, a veteran investigator with gray hair and tired eyes, spoke up. "We've suspected something for months, but complaints kept vanishing. Someone higher up was protecting him." The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. Dr. Thompson pulled out her phone and played a recording. The young officer from Mitchell's precinct describing how the scheme worked. The commissioner's face grew darker with each detail: how Mitchell picked his targets, how the towing company moved parts across state lines, how other officers were either paid to look the other way or threatened into silence. "There's more," Dr. Thompson continued, pulling out another folder. "My neighbor, a retired FBI agent, helped me connect some dots. The parts from these cars are showing up in luxury car repair shops 3 states away. This isn't just local corruption, it's interstate trafficking." The meeting lasted hours. Plans were made, tasks assigned, and a careful strategy developed. They couldn't move too quickly. If Mitchell had protection from higher up, They needed to be smart about how they proceeded. Dr. Thompson's role would be crucial. She would become the face of the victims, someone whose credentials and position couldn't be easily dismissed. As they worked, more calls kept coming in. A local news reporter who'd been trying to break the story for months offered to help. Community leaders who'd heard whispers about Mitchell's scheme for years pledged their support. Even a few honest officers from Mitchell's precinct reached out, tired of watching their badges be tarnished by corruption. Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital's security team. They'd tracked her Mercedes to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, right next to Big Al's Towing. Satellite images showed dozens of other luxury cars parked behind the building, partially hidden under tarps. The commissioner immediately dispatched undercover officers to monitor the location. As the meeting wrapped up, Dr. Thompson felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but adrenaline kept her going. The commissioner's wife hugged her, whispering, "Thank you for being brave enough to fight back." But Dr. Thompson didn't feel brave. She felt responsible. Someone had to stand up, and she had the resources and support to do it effectively. Walking to her rideshare car, she'd been offered a police escort but declined, not knowing who to trust. She thought about all the people who'd lost their cars to Mitchell's scheme. Many couldn't afford to fight back, couldn't risk their jobs or reputations by making waves. Well, she could fight back, and she would, not just for herself, but for all of them. Her phone buzzed again. Officer Mitchell had just started his shift, probably expecting another routine day of targeting innocent people. He had no idea that with every passing hour, the net around him was tightening. Sometimes justice worked slowly, but when it moved with the combined force of countless people who'd finally had enough. The investigation moved quickly over the next few days. Dr. Thompson's team had set up a temporary command center in an empty conference room at the hospital. Maps covered the walls, showing the movement of stolen car parts across state lines. Red strings connected photos of key players, and a whiteboard listed dozens of victim statements. The retired FBI agent sat at a computer, analyzing financial records they'd obtained through legal channels. His eyes widened as he followed the money trail. "Look at this," he called out to Dr. Thompson, who was reviewing security camera footage from around Big Al's Towing. Mitchell's been making regular deposits to offshore accounts. Small amounts, never enough to trigger automatic reports. Their investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Big Al's Towing wasn't just a front for car theft. It was part of a sophisticated operation. High-end cars would disappear during transport, their parts stripped and sold to repair shops across the country. The paperwork was always perfect, making it nearly impossible to prove anything was wrong. Dr. Thompson's cousin, the civil rights attorney, burst into the room with exciting news. "We've got him," she exclaimed, waving a stack of papers. "Remember that young officer who came forward? He kept a secret logbook of every suspicious tow Mitchell ordered. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions. Everything matches the missing cars reported in those neighborhoods." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A mechanic at one of the repair shops had been keeping his own records. He'd grown suspicious of the two perfect parts arriving from Big Al's, complete with documentation that looked right but felt wrong. His detailed notes provided the missing link they needed. Meanwhile, the internal affairs investigation uncovered more corruption within the department. 2 senior officers were found to be on Big Al's payroll, explaining why earlier complaints had disappeared. The web of deception went deeper than anyone had imagined, but now it was finally unraveling. Dr. Thompson received a call from the police commissioner. They'd placed tracking devices on several cars at Mitchell's favorite hunting grounds. Sure enough, 3 more vehicles had been improperly impounded in the past week alone. Each one followed the same pattern. Mitchell would find a minor violation, call Big Al's, and the cars would vanish into the network. The team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and determination. They cross-referenced every piece of evidence, building an airtight case that even the most expensive lawyers couldn't tear apart. Dr. Thompson's medical training proved unexpectedly useful. Her attention to detail and ability to spot patterns helped them connect seemingly unrelated incidents. One evening, as they reviewed security footage from the hospital parking garage, they spotted something interesting. The night Mitchell had stopped Dr. Thompson, another patrol car had been following him. The driver's face wasn't visible, but the car's number was clear. When they ran it through department records, they found it belonged to one of the corrupt senior officers. The young officer who'd kept the logbook brought in more evidence. He'd managed to photograph the inside of Big Al's office during a routine call. The pictures showed boards listing delivery schedules and repair shop contacts. In one corner, partially visible, was a list of officer badge numbers. Police who were either involved or had been paid to look the other way. As the sun set on another long day of investigation, Dr. Thompson stood at the window of the conference room, watching the city lights come on. Her Mercedes was still missing, probably being stripped for parts in some warehouse. But this wasn't about one car anymore. It was about stopping a system that had preyed on innocent people for years. Her phone buzzed with a message from the commissioner. They had enough evidence to move forward. Tomorrow, federal agents would join the case, turning it into a multi-state investigation. Mitchell had no idea that his routine traffic stop of a tired doctor had just triggered the beginning of the end for his entire operation. The story broke on a Monday morning. Every major news channel in the city led with the same headline: Police officer's luxury car theft ring exposed. Dr. Thompson's dashcam footage played on screens across the country, showing Mitchell's abuse of power in crystal clear detail. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with calls from other victims wanting to share their stories. A nurse who'd lost her brand new SUV. A teacher whose sports car disappeared after a routine traffic stop. A small business owner whose delivery van had been stripped for parts. Each story added another piece to the growing puzzle. Social media exploded with the news. People began sharing their own recordings of encounters with Mitchell and his associates. Security camera footage from nearby businesses showed the same tow truck appearing suspiciously quickly after Mitchell's traffic stops. The evidence kept piling up, impossible to ignore or dismiss. At police headquarters, the commissioner held a press conference. Standing at the podium, he looked both angry and determined. "What happened here is a betrayal of everything the badge stands for," he declared. Behind him, screens showed photographs of the warehouse where they'd found dozens of stripped luxury vehicles, including Dr. Thompson's Mercedes. The FBI raid on Big Al's towing had been perfectly timed. Agents caught workers in the act of dismantling a recently impounded BMW. The owner's personal belongings were still in the trunk. Computers seized from the office contained detailed records of every car they'd stolen, every part they'd sold, and every officer they'd paid off. Dr. Thompson watched the news coverage from her office, taking a rare break between surgeries. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support and thanks. Many came from fellow doctors who'd experienced similar encounters but had been afraid to speak up. Now they were all coming forward, their combined voices impossible to silence. The young officer who'd kept the secret logbook was being hailed as a hero. His detailed records provided the evidence needed to identify other corrupt officers in the department. He spoke at a community meeting, his voice shaking but determined. "I joined the force to protect people," he said. Staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone. Local repair shops began coming forward too, sharing invoices from parts they'd unknowingly purchased from the stolen car ring. Some had suspected something wasn't right, but hadn't known who to trust. Now, with the story public, they provided crucial evidence about how the operation had spread across state lines. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting to discuss police reform. Dr. Thompson was invited to speak, along with other victims of Mitchell's scheme. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. When Dr. Thompson took the podium, she didn't talk about her stolen car. Instead, she talked about responsibility. The responsibility of those with power to use it wisely, and the responsibility of those with resources to fight back against abuse. The most powerful moment came when a group of honest officers from Mitchell's precinct stood up to speak. They described the culture of fear and silence that had protected corrupt officers like Mitchell. "We're supposed to protect and serve," one officer said, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, we start living up to that promise again." By evening, national news crews had set up outside the police station. Mitchell's scheme had become more than a local story. It was a symbol of how corruption could flourish when good people stayed silent. But it was also becoming a story of how that same corruption could be defeated when people finally stood together. Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed one last time that day. It was a message from the commissioner. They'd found more cars, more evidence, and more officers involved. Tomorrow would bring another round of arrests. The story wasn't over, but its ending was already being written, not by one person, but by an entire community that had finally said enough. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras on the morning of Mitchell's arraignment. He looked smaller somehow in his civilian clothes, without the badge and uniform that had given him so much power. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by the nervous glances of someone who finally understood the weight of his actions. Inside the courtroom, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecutor presented a timeline of his crimes, illustrated with photos of stolen vehicles, financial records, and surveillance footage. The dashcam video from Dr. Thompson's car played on the courtroom screens, showing the beginning of the end for Mitchell's operation. His police union had withdrawn their support after seeing the mountain of evidence. Mitchell's expensive private lawyer sat beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable as more details emerged. The federal charges were particularly serious: interstate trafficking, corruption under color of authority, civil rights violations. Each charge carried substantial prison time. But the real story was happening outside the courthouse. Victims had gathered, not to protest, but to support each other. They shared stories of lost vehicles, financial hardship, and a helplessness they'd felt when no one would believe them. Now, finally, they were being heard. The police commissioner announced major reforms at a press conference nearby. Every traffic stop would now require active body cameras. Towing companies would be strictly regulated and monitored. A new civilian oversight committee would review complaints, with Dr. Thompson invited to serve as one of its first members. The young officer who'd exposed the scheme was promoted to a new internal affairs division, specifically created to investigate corruption. His first task would be reviewing years of Mitchell's cases, looking for other victims who deserved justice. Other officers, inspired by his courage, began coming forward with information about other corrupt practices. Big Al's Towing was shut down, its property seized by federal agents. The warehouse where they'd stripped stolen cars was being converted into a community center, a symbol of transformation. Local repair shops formed an association to prevent stolen parts from entering their supply chain, with strict verification procedures. Dr. Thompson received a call from the hospital board. They wanted to establish a legal defense fund for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford lawyers. The idea had already received pledges of support from other hospitals and medical practices across the city. It would be named after her, though she tried to decline the honor. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other police departments across the country began reviewing their own procedures, not wanting to face similar scandals. Community groups organized workshops on knowing your rights during traffic stops. Body camera companies reported a surge in orders from police departments nationwide. Mitchell's former partner broke down during questioning by Internal Affairs. He revealed how the scheme had started small, just a few cars here and there, but grew as Mitchell became bolder and greedier. The partner's testimony implicated several higher-ranking officers who had protected the operation in exchange for a cut of the profits. In the hospital parking garage, Dr. Thompson finally got her Mercedes back. It had been recovered before too much damage was done, though she decided to donate it to a program helping victims of the scheme get back on their feet. She drove home in a simple hybrid car instead, feeling lighter somehow. The evening news showed Mitchell being led away in handcuffs after the judge denied bail. The reporter interviewed several victims, but the most powerful statement came from an elderly gentleman who'd lost his retirement project car to the scheme. It was never about the cars, he said. his voice steady. It was about trust. Today, we started rebuilding that trust. As darkness fell over the city, Dr. Thompson sat in her office, finishing up patient notes. Her phone had finally stopped buzzing with constant updates. The story would continue tomorrow. More arrests, more revelations, more changes. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right can change more than just one person's life. 1 year later, Dr. Thompson stood at the podium of the newly established Community Justice Center, addressing a room full of people whose lives had been touched by the case. The center, funded by the settlement money from the civil suits against the corrupt officers, had become a symbol of positive change in the city. The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a powerful story. Over 300 stolen vehicles had been recovered and returned to their owners. 42 corrupt officers had been removed from duty. The interstate car theft ring had been completely dismantled, with Big Al and his associates facing lengthy federal prison sentences. Mitchell himself had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after a trial that revealed the full scope of his crimes. His conviction had triggered a review of every case he'd ever handled, leading to the discovery of hundreds more victims. The Legal Defense Fund, now officially named the Community Justice Initiative, was helping these victims get their day in court. But the real changes were more personal. Dr. Thompson looked out at the faces in the audience. The young officer who'd first exposed the corruption, now leading anti-corruption training for police cadets. The retired FBI agent who'd helped crack the case, mentoring a new generation of investigators. The victims who'd become advocates, helping others navigate the system. The police commissioner's wife sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Under her leadership, the hospital board had expanded the Legal Defense Fund into a full scholarship program, helping children of victims pursue careers in law enforcement, medicine, or legal advocacy. It was about changing the system from within, one person at a time. In the parking lot outside, officers chatted with community members during their break. Their body cameras were always on now, a policy that had dramatically reduced complaints while protecting both officers and civilians. The towing industry had been reformed too, with strict oversight and transparent procedures that made corruption much harder to hide. Dr. Thompson shared stories from the past year. How the Community Justice Center had helped a single mother recover her stolen car and get back to work. How a group of reformed officers had started a mentorship program for at-risk youth. How the young officers' courage had inspired others to speak up against corruption in their own departments. The center itself had become a model for other cities. Delegations came from across the country to learn how one corrupt traffic stop had sparked a movement for positive change. The building's walls were covered with success stories, photos of reunited families, recovered vehicles, and community events that brought police and citizens together. As she concluded her speech, Dr. Thompson announced the center's newest initiative, a partnership with local auto shops to provide free safety inspections and basic repairs to low-income families. It was another way to prevent people from becoming vulnerable to corrupt officers looking for easy targets. The applause was warm, but the real reward was in the conversations that followed. People sharing their stories, offering support, building connections. A young police cadet told Dr. Thompson how the case had inspired her to join the force, determined to be part of the positive change. An elderly couple thanked her for giving them hope that justice was still possible. Outside, the city skyline glowed in the evening light. Dr. Thompson's new hybrid car sat in the parking lot, its dashcam a quiet reminder of how one piece of technology had helped expose years of corruption. But the real change hadn't come from technology. It had come from people willing to stand up, speak out, and work together. As she drove home that evening, Dr. Thompson thought about how a single traffic stop had changed so many lives, not through violence or revenge, but through persistence, cooperation, and a belief that justice was worth fighting for. The city wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was better. And sometimes, that's the most important victory of all.